She suddenly sent a strong gust of wind at the male with a quick flap of her wings, which he folded his own wings in to defend himself against. She followed up instantly by shooting off at him like a bullet with her head lowered down low. With his wings still wrapped around him, she plowed straight into the normal-colored male Butterfree and sent him skidding back several feet through the air. Deciding to capitalize on her fast-starting momentum, she charged straight at him again while his wings were still folded in. Intent on smashing into him once more. Ash's Butterfree unfurled his wings powerfully just as she came upon him and sent her skidding backwards with the wind he turned up from the outward thrust. He followed this up by charging at her in a burst of speed. The female prepared herself to defend against his attack, but just as he was upon her, he suddenly veered to the left and sent a burst of wind at her instead, which she defended with her wings folded into her body. When she unfurled them, she found the male at her other side some distance away, firing off another gust of wind at her. She defended this time with her own gust of wind and the two gales met together, canceling the other out. The male started flying around her at all different angles, firing off round after round of wind at her that she would defend against by either folding her wings in or using her own air-based attacks. This went on for quite some time, him flying around her while she stayed in one place and defended herself or moved around slightly, trying to find an angle in which she could escape from the barrage of gusty attacks being thrown her way. After what seemed like several minutes of that same type of battle, the male Butterfree suddenly stopped what he was doing and shot up into the air like a speeding rocket. The pink Butterfree looked up at him with weariness and took a defensive position. Ready for the attack she felt was coming. However, what surprised her the most was when he stopped mid-ascent and looked down at her expectantly, almost willing her to follow after him. Not one to turn down a challenge, the pink female gave chase and went after him. Up and up they went through the sky, surpassing all of the Butterfree and even the balloons down below as they entered the cover of the clouds. Ash's Butterfree turned around and sent a gust of wind at the female, which she was forced to veer to the right in order to dodge, temporarily taking her eyes off of him. This proved to be a bad decision though, because the very next moment, the same time in which she looked forward again, the male was gone. Disappeared into the cloud cover that was as thick as a blanket of fog at such an elevation. She started looking around wildly, trying to find where he had gone, afraid of some sneak attack. Suddenly, a blast of wind came rushing at her from behind and she turned around just in time to get out of the way of the torrent of air that had been launched her way from the now open maw of a nearby cloud bank. No sooner did she escape the attack and a blur of white and blue came rushing in from the clouds on her right, passing from one direction to the other while sending powerful gusts of wind her way. She used her own gusts to defend herself and then began guarding from every angle as the male Butterfree went from cloud to cloud, launching his attacks at her, which she would become quite hard-pressed to evade or block in some way. This only lasted a short time, however, because the very next minute, the male came hurtling out from a cloud behind her with his right wing raised back in a striking position. She raised her own wing just in time and met his with a resounding slap that could only be heard by them. He quickly lifted his other wing up and then brought it down. The female was forced to disengage her hold with his other wing so she could stay hovering and met his other wing just in time. Soon, a battle of close combat ensued with both Butterfree fighting through the small arena they had made for themselves up in the cover of the clouds. Wings, feet and even heads smashed against one another as they continued their strange and violent dance of courtship. The pink Butterfree managed to slip underneath of the male's wing strikes and came up under his chin with her foot, knocking him back a little. She quickly followed up with a fierce strike to the face with both wings at different times and then headbutted him hard, sending the other Butterfree hurtling back into the cover of the clouds. She hovered in place while slightly out of breath until, at the very next moment, she saw the clouds in front of her appear as though they were coming to life as a large mass of them began moving her way. The female backed up slowly, as far as she could until her back was to the cloud bank behind her and then, not wanting to be stuck in a cloud haze, started beating her wings fiercely in an attempt to push back the clouds. This strategy worked well and the mass of white fluff began quickly getting blown away. After several moments of tirelessly beating her wings, the wall of moving clouds finally stopped and so did she. Her head lowered forward slightly as she tried to get her breath back from the frenzied flapping she had been forced to do, panting as she did so. Suddenly, she saw a blue streak flash in front of her and when she looked up, she saw the male Butterfree hovering over her with his wings being rapidly lowered towards her. Too late to respond after what she just did, the pink female could only watch as the wing descended upon her. Waiting to feel the collision she knew was coming for her body. To her surprise though, it didn't happen. Instead of being hit with a wing, she was blasted back by another gust of wind that sent her flying downwards. She managed to right herself and looked to see Ash's Butterfree speeding down past her towards the open sky below the clouds. She gave chase instantly, not understanding why he wouldn't just fight her outright, and followed him down through the clouds until they were out into the open airspace again. The male Butterfree hurtled himself down towards the large mass of other Butterfree that were all congregated together. The pink female giving chase as fast she could but not being able to process why he was doing what he was doing. He ended up flying straight down into the mass of Butterfree and she went in after him. Almost instantly, she lost sight of him amongst all the many bodies of Butterfree that all were the same color as he was. It was times like this that her strange coloring became a real nuisance and she hated it. He could blend in with the others but she stuck out like a sore thumb. Her pink body and lightly pink-tinted wings contrasted poorly with the rest of them. She eventually spotted him some yards away in a small break between the others, almost like he was waiting for her, and she shot off towards him. Not giving any thought or care as to what he was up to or why he was doing what he was. Her only thought was catching him and winning their battle. She knew how strong he was, so she didn't get why he wouldn't just fight, and it maddened her. So, on she chased him. Through the maze of bodies that her kin made up for them. He led her up, down, around and through some of the tightest spots possible, and if she wasn't such a good flyer, she knew she would have crashed into the others many times already. Even still, almost all eyes were on them from the other Butterfree as she followed him through the large crowd like she was his shadow. Pretty soon the male broke free from the Butterfree and started heading toward the balloons full of trainers. She huffed to herself and gave chase, still cursing her wings as they started to feel the fatigue of flying so far, so much and so fast. Not to mention, with the little bit of fighting they had already done and the stress from the day as a whole, everything was really starting to take its toll on her stamina. It didn't help either that the after effects of the shock treatment Jessie put her through was slowing her down slightly. Which was why she wondering how Ash's Butterfree could still go. He had fought the group of other male Butterfree earlier on that day, had went through the entire situation with Team Rocket and suffered through whatever it was that he and his trainer had underwent back at the warehouse, but he was still flying much faster than she was. The female didn't understand it, but she knew that she did want to stop whatever game of chase they were playing. Ash's Butterfree flew in between the many balloons floating in the air, swerving, ducking and dodging around all of them and doing some pretty amazing stunts as he did so. She followed right behind him the whole time, and the trainers watched in awe at the two Butterfree flying around their balloons like small dots of light as one attempted to catch the other. Neither one slowed down at all, and everyone watching was left with the impression that they were truly being treated to something special. Both Butterfree even flew near their respective trainers' balloons, the male obviously showing off for them all, before he abruptly started speeding towards the center of the airspace in the sky. Going so fast that one could nearly see the wind trail behind him. The female gave chase as fast she could, but she wasn't fast enough to fully keep up with him. Especially not in her tiring state. With no warning, he suddenly began dive bombing down towards the ground at breakneck speed while she much less gracefully followed. The male nearly collided with the green planes below but pulled himself up and started flying level with the ground just before he did. The pink female nearly collided with the ground but managed to right herself as well and followed him as he flew along open plains, speeding through the open area and around the cops that were stationed around the cliffside to keep an eye out for trouble. The police watched on in amazement, Jenny included, as the two Butterfree flew around them and even right over their heads at some points. Ash's Butterfree then started flying right at the police helicopter that was parked some distance away and picked up speed as he drew closer. The female was feeling nervous as they neared the vehicle, and the male showed no signs of slowing down either. Right before they could hit the vehicle, Butterfree dropped down low and passed right through the legs of the chopper, not even grazing an antenna. She managed to follow him through with much nervous trepidation, but her success, unfortunately, was short-lived. He then began flying towards the forest that bordered the grassy plains of the mating grounds, and she followed still, not really being given any other choice. Butterfree led the pink female into the thick forest at the edge of the plains and immediately started flying through the roughest patches he could find, weaving and dodging in and around trees and other such foliage with no break in pace. She followed him as closely as she could, and as they flew, like phantoms passing through the trees, several wild Pokémon like Pidgey, Rattata, Nidoran and even some Spearow watched the two Butterfree speed by them with slight interest, stopping the routines of whatever they were doing to make sure they weren't just seeing things. With no warning, the male launched himself upwards and busted through the treetops of the forest, finding open sky yet again. As usual, she followed him with no pause or hesitation, even though her wings were starting to burn badly from fatigue and exhaustion. He then flew them both directly towards the cliffs and, to her dismay, starting flying in the direction of the expansive sea that stretched out far out into the distance in front of them. Ash's Butterfree went down as close to the water as possible after making his descent from the height of the cliffs and stayed level with the water as waves rose and fell below him. The pink Butterfree trailed behind while nervously looking everywhere around her, obviously not comfortable with flying so low to the water for fear of a predatory water type reaching up and grabbing them. She looked down and saw small schools of Magikarp, Tentacool and even Goldeen swim just below the surface of the waves. She then looked up just in time to see a large wave about to crash down on her and managed to pull up just before it could take her down into the salty sea water. After escaping the near-fatal upset, she continued following her target as he began pulling himself up into the air and started taking to the sky again. She went after him naturally, but this time, the sun was right in her face and he seemed to be heading straight for it. Eventually, they went so high up into the sky that the pink female had to squint her eyes against the sun's powerful rays, barely able to make out Ash's Butterfree as he had now stopped and was silhouetted against the light of the sun. The female took a quick moment to admire how regal he looked against the backdrop of the sun before he suddenly did a flipping turn in midair and started flying back towards the plains yet again where everyone else was gathered. He took her to the very middle of the airspace, in between the mass of Butterfree and the trainers in their balloons, and just stopped dead, making an almost perfect center in the middle of everything in the spot that he paused at. The female stopped as well, merely 20 or so yards away from him, and started hovering in place, breathing very heavily from the extremely long session of intense flying she had just done while her wings felt about ready to fall off. Ash's Butterfree looked at her with an unreadable expression and then took a battle position, finally ready to face her. She couldn't believe it was only now, after all of that, that he was finally ready to fight her, but she took a shaky combat position anyway. Before she could even move, he was soaring towards her like a flash and was upon her in seconds. She jumped, startled at his speed, but hastily prepared herself for whatever he was about to do. Butterfree just spread his wings out and hovered in front of her imposingly, still not making any move to strike her. He didn't even lift a wing. This confused the female, but she wasn't going to just stay there and do nothing, waiting for him to finally do whatever it was he was planning. Even though she was exhausted and felt like she could drop at any second, she raised her left wing anyway and made to hit him. The male just stayed where he was and didn't make a move to stop her. Even as her wing made contact to the side of his face with surprising force and caused his head to whip to the right slightly, he still didn't move. The pink female started smacking him over and over again on each side of his face with her wings, and each time, he did nothing and merely turned his head back to face her again. This continued on and on with each of her strikes slowly losing more and more power. Back in the balloon, Misty was gripping the side of the railing so hard that her knuckles had turned white. What's going on out there? Why is Butterfree just hovering there and letting her attack him like that? He could easily fight her off with how tired she is right now. Brock seemed contemplative. I don't think that's what Butterfree is going for, Misty. I don't know exactly what's going on right now, but I believe he has something planned and that's why he's not moving. He trailed off then and continued to look thoughtful at the reasons for why Butterfree was doing what he was. Giselle looked over at Ash, who seemed to be completely enthralled and focused on the action in front of them, before she too returned her attention back to the two Butterfree, resolving to remain silent and see how things played out. The pink Butterfree was breathing hard and sweating from her brow as she gave one final smack to Ash's Butterfree, who still remained motionless, and finally stopped. She glared at him and moved closer. Free. Butterfree, free Butterfree. She shouted at him angrily, obviously demanding to know why he wasn't fighting her. Butterfree just stared at her with an unreadable expression and then finally spoke. Free. Butterfree. Free Butterfree free, he said with resolution in his voice. She froze and just looked at him with wide eyes. Whatever he said seeming to have shaken her. He moved a little closer to her and spoke again, free free. Butterfree free. Free Butterfree. The female continued to look at him shakily and then, to everyone's surprise, her eyes began to water. Her whole body started to shake as she looked at the male with her watery eyes and then raised her right wing. She shouted fiercely at him and then brought down her wing right at his head. Free. The female yelled, loudly enough to be heard by the winds that carried and amplified her voice through the now dead silent airspace. The male Butterfree finally moved and right before he could be hit with the female's wing, he brought his own up and blocked hers with no effort. She glared down at him with burning tear-filled eyes and then, slowly, inch by inch, he pushed his wing against hers and started moving it backwards. She struggled against him vainly as he continued to push back against her until eventually, he pushed through her defenses. The male quickly flew in until he was merely a breath away from the female and brought his face in closer to hers. The pink Butterfree made a half-hearted attempt to back away but the male's strong gaze held her locked in place. He looked at her with several emotions now swirling within the depths of his eyes as he came a little closer and spoke in a voice that was only for her to hear him. Free. Butterfree free. Butterfree free. Butter. He gently brought his left wing up and wrapped it around her own left one, slowly pulling her in closer to him. Free. He finished in a breathy whisper as he gazed at her warmly. The female didn't even try to resist as she seemed to be completely enraptured by the words the male had spoken to her. Any form of anger or irritation she had felt towards him earlier just completely vanished when he said those words that only she could hear. Free. Butterfree free. She asked him as she looked at Ash's Butterfree. He merely smiled at her in the best way a Butterfree could and then pointed at his own body with one of his wings, showing the bruises he still held from the fight with Team Rocket. He looked back at her and pointed from himself to her, making gesturing motions from the marks on his body to her. Like he was trying to get something across to her. Whatever it was finally got through to her apparently because the next thing he knew, the pink female started getting even more teary-eyed as she now indeed understood what he was trying to tell her. Before he could even hope to brace himself, she threw herself at him and hugged him tightly with her wings, practically hanging from him while a few tears fell from her eyes. Butterfree just hugged her close and gently caressed her back with one wing while he kept them aloft with the other one. She eventually separated herself from him and when she did, Butterfree reached up with one wing and gently wiped the tears from her eyes while giving her a warm look and an eye smile. The two of them just looked at each other then for a time, neither one making any kind of move. Everyone. Ash and his friends, the rest of the trainers, the other Butterfree and even the police down below watched with rapt attention for what would happen next. To everyone's surprise, excitement and utter joy, the next action taken by the pink Butterfree was one of long-awaited celebration. She backed away from the male Butterfree a short distance and once she was far enough away, she began to slowly fly herself around in slow circles. The movement and speed of it was very precisely timed out and seemed to have been perfected and honed through many, many years of deeply ingrained instincts and natural behavior, passed down from one generation to the next. The female then started moving from just circular rotations to more complexly intricate and beautiful patterns, such as front and back movements, elegant dips and graceful spins, perfectly executed twirls and beautiful pirouettes, well-honed flips and other movements that showcased her power but also her feminine grace and beauty as a female Butterfree. She made her way towards Ash's Butterfree and started doing her elegant dance around him, moving in closely and then moving back away quickly but gracefully, obviously making it her sole priority to keep his eyes trained on her, which she was doing a damn good job at too if the way his eyes were locked onto her unblinkingly was any indication. Eventually she moved back and slowed down to doing just slow circles and slight movements while she looked at Ash's Butterfree expectantly. Rather it was that he understood what she wanted or he just felt compelled by his instincts. Butterfree started doing his own pattern of movements in the air. His were both similar to hers and yet also different. Meant to showcase his own grace and elegance, yet also demonstrate the skill, power and strength that a well-trained male of his species would be expected to possess. And he didn't disappoint. All of his movements showed his ability to be fast and elegant, but also displayed just how strong and powerful he could be. He did his dance around the female, just like she did for him, and then once he was done, they both started dancing around each other, staying in perfect tandem with one another as they synced their moves in the unique dance they were disputing with their eyes firmly locked onto the other. Everyone else watched in awe as this went on, even the other Butterfree, while Giselle seemed as though she was watching a five-star performance. Wow. It's so beautiful, what do you think they're doing? She asked the others in the balloon. Ash finally broke his silence. I feel very confident right now in stating that both of them have finally accepted each other as mates and are currently performing a very complex and intricate version of the Butterfree courtship dance. He looked over at Donnie. Am I right? The man nodded as his eyes stayed locked on both Butterfree. You've got that right, Ash. What we're seeing is most definitely the Butterfree courtship ritual, but this one is much more complex, as you said, than what is normally performed. They must truly care for each other if they are so willing to put this much into the dance, he observed wisely and knowingly. That's for sure, Brock stated. Even though I've never actually seen the Butterfree courtship before, this does seem like a very advanced form of what they normally do. At least from what I've heard, that is. Misty turned back to look at them. But I'm confused, why did they fight first before doing the ritual when they obviously liked each other? Why didn't Butterfree fight back when the pink one was attacking him, and most importantly, why was she so upset earlier? Ash stepped forward and placed one hand on the basket rail while putting the other one up on one of the beams. Well, I'm not an expert, Misty, and I may be wrong about all of this, but taking everything Professor Oak taught me about Pokemon's emotions and characteristics, I might know why. He looked at both Butterfree that were still dancing around each other then as he continued. To answer your first question, I think the pink one wanted to prove that she was strong enough for not only my Butterfree, but to prove her strength to herself and everyone else as well. Undoubtedly, she probably felt bad when Team Rocket took them all and she was so helpless the whole time. She seems to be a proud and strong Pokemon that likes to stand up for herself. Being bailed out probably made her feel weak, and fighting my Butterfree was the one way of making her feel better about herself. A way to self-redemption, if you will, I guess. He took a breath. As for why my Butterfree didn't fight her, I think that was more because of the values he has and the values I try to instill into all of my Pokemon. Which is respect. Mom and Professor Oak taught me that respect is key in life in all that you do, and Mom also told me that when it came to women, you respected and valued them no matter what the cost or cause. I taught my Butterfree, just like all of my other Pokemon, to respect the opposite sex and treat them with tenderness and kindness at all times. Even though he understood why the pink Butterfree wanted to fight, mine didn't want to fight her or engage in physical combat because that's not what he wanted to show her. He knew that she saw he was strong and impressive in a fight. I think he wanted to show her now just how noble and respectable of a Pokemon he is instead of just a mindless brute. Ash smiled proudly. However, I also think that he didn't want to make her feel like he thought he was superior over her just because he was a male by not fighting her, so he accepted the challenge. Fully aware of how tough she was and how much of a beating she could put on him. He decided that instead of just brawling with her and causing her physical pain, which she could most definitely take, Butterfree wanted to prove how gentle, soft and kind he could be, not to mention patient, by taking her on a grueling aerial chase where they could still test each other's skill and strength but in a different way. She also proved, unknowingly to her, that she was willing to follow him without question or hesitation as he took her on that crazy flight. He shrugged. So I guess basically, he wanted to show that he didn't need to fight her in order to make her see how strong she could be or to prove how worthy he was of being her mate by just fighting her. She was able to keep up with him the whole time, fight him very well the few times they did so, and also showed just how good she was at making up battle strategies and tactics on the spot without fail. Which I believe all served to bolster her confidence. Ash shifted his weight on the support beam he was leaning against then. I think she was upset at him for a time because she thought he wasn't taking her seriously and was just running away so he didn't have to fight with her out of a fear of injuring her. This obviously hurt her pride and made her feel angry at the very thought. Which is why she was so aggressive whenever she was attacking him at the very end. Butterfree responded passively, and that's when he explained to her the reasons, the ones I just explained, for why he did what he did. Why he didn't fight her. He wanted her to know just how much he respected her and get her to understand that he was indeed fighting her. Just not in the way she thought he would. The boy ran his hand through his hair as he continued trying to piece the unusual puzzle of this particular Butterfree courtship together. I believe that alone made the pink Butterfree become really emotional and is what brought her to tears. Then, whenever my Butterfree pointed to the bruises and marks he got from the battle against Team Rocket, he was showing her that he took those scars for not just himself and to rescue the other Butterfree, but also for her. He would do anything to protect her, and that's what I think he was trying to get across to her when he was doing that. Naturally, such an act of care and love is very deep and thus, brought her to tears when she realized the truth. Leading her to finally deciding that he was the one for her and starting off the courtship ritual between them. Since they are both very strong and respect each other so much, they played out their dances to portray those same feelings to one another in their own way. Hence, why their dance seems so much more intricate, deep and involved than other Butterfree mating rituals. It's just a way to show a higher degree of respect really, I guess, he finally finished. Donnie nodded and smiled. Way to go, Ash. That was very perceptive of you, and I think you're exactly right in what you surmised. I've been watching the Butterfree mating rituals for years and I've never seen two Butterfree like yours and that pink one go to such far-reaching lengths to make mates with one another. For a kid especially, that was a very good observation you made. I think Professor Oak has been teaching you well, he commended. Brock chimed in, I was thinking along the same lines as you were, Ash, and I'm impressed you put it together so quickly. I think you're exactly right. Misty just looked at both Butterfree in awe. That's just amazing, she said breathlessly. Giselle's eyes were almost shining as she looked at the Butterfree as well. Both of them being illuminated by the slowly setting sun that was falling over the sea and making their courtship dance seem that much more beautiful and spectacular. Pokémon are just. I can't even put it into words, she started with a pause. The different personalities, character traits of all Pokémon and just how unique each one is from the last. You can't get this in a classroom, she finished with pure happiness and appreciation in her voice as she continued to admire the Butterfree. Ash smiled at the way the setting sun also seemed to bring out the utter beauty in his girlfriend and walked up behind her, holding the brunette from behind closely as he kissed her cheek and shared the view of the two amazing Butterfree. You're right, Giselle, and I'm glad you could be here with us to witness this, he said with a smile. She returned the smile with a radiant one of her own and then leaned in to gently kiss him, which he happily returned, before returning her focus back to the two Butterfree as she leaned into her boyfriend's arms. Brock and Misty walked up to stand on either side of them and then just watched the special and unique scene continue to unfold. Donnie did the same from his position, now controlling the balloon in Ash's place, while Salia looked on from her own balloon as well. Eventually, the dance between both Butterfree ended on a beautiful note with the both of them in a perfectly executed pose. The pink Butterfree was leaned back slightly while the male had her supported with one of his wings. His other wing was in contact with hers while she kept them both aloft with her other wing. All of the other trainers, the police down below, the many other Butterfree and Ash's group all burst into cheers and applause upon seeing both Butterfree finally finish their courtship, officially taking themselves as each other's mate. The newly mated pair returned to Ash's balloon after a few more moments and perched themselves on the edge, side by side. Pikachu was the first to talk to the two, congratulating them on their relationship and winking at his team member with a knowing look. Something that made Butterfree shoot the electric type a harsh glare with a faint blush on his face. However, Pikachu merely turned away and giggled perversely to himself with a paw over his mouth. Ash was the next one to congratulate them. Well, you two, congratulations on your courtship. I'm very proud of both you for everything you did today, and you showed just how amazing you are as Pokémon. I'm very happy for you and I'm sure you're going to be really happy together. He looked at his Butterfree and stroked one of his wings affectionately. You've made me really proud, Butterfree, he said with a smile, to which his Pokémon puffed up with pride at. The pink one flew up to Ash quickly and nuzzled his face before returning to her mate's side, her way of showing appreciation for the trainer that she had come to respect and like quite a lot by the looks of it. Misty, Brock, Giselle and Donnie all congratulated them as well after that, and then Salia flew her balloon in closer so she could do the same. Misty needing to, once again, hold Brock back from lunging at the poor woman. Butterfree. She started softly to her former Pokémon. I am so very proud of you. You've grown into a wonderful Butterfree that I truly can't take all the credit for how you are. Much of who you have become was just picked up naturally, I believe, and I couldn't be more proud of you. She then looked at Ash's Butterfree, who was standing beside of the pink one. And you've chosen a very fine mate that I don't think any other Butterfree here could ever hope to match. I just know you are going to be very happy together and give birth to beautiful babies. She gushed. Both Butterfree just bushed at hearing that and then looked down in embarrassment while fidgeting slightly. Ash smiled at the sight and then captured the attention of everyone. Hey everybody, now that mine and Salia's Butterfree are mated together and good to go, why don't we just stay up here, relax and watch the rest of the courtship between the other Butterfree? Just enjoy the rest of the mating season until it ends. The sun is starting to set and right now, the view is just beautiful. He observed as he looked out across the lush, expansive plains. Everyone else did the same, and indeed it was a sight to behold. The way the sun had started to set was bathing the entirety of the mating grounds and the cliffside in a beautiful spectrum of colors as the light bounced off of the sea, which was as calm right now as the gentle breeze that blew through the area and caused a beautiful sparkling of the waves to shimmer in the distance. The sky had collected a few fluffy clouds together and was now displaying colors of a reddish-orange which stretched across the vast great beyond as though Arceus herself had painted it. The forests behind them danced along to the mild breeze of the wind's gentle song as the leaves on the trees swayed to and fro in a beautiful harmony, and the grass far below shared in a similar dance of nature's own orchestrating. The grass that covered the plains of the mating grounds was still surprisingly green, even, only showing a few signs of wilt despite the fact that it was fallen in late October. All in all, it was a truly beautiful time and the perfect occasion to just sit back with precious ones and watch the natural splendor of the fading day. Such is the ceremony of the Butterfree mating ritual still taking place before their very eyes within the gentle cradle of the sky's tender embrace. Apparently, everyone else agreed with Ash's statement after taking in the natural beauty before them. Yeah Ash, I'm game, Misty said enthusiastically. Pikachu agreed happily. I would love to. Giselle joined in as she hugged Ash's arm. Me too, Brock nodded with a smile. Sounds good to me, Salia agreed readily. Both of the newly mated Butterfree nodded as well, showing they were in agreement with the suggestion. Donnie smiled and clapped his hands together. Well then, if we're gonna do this, I think it's time we bring out the luxury treatment, he announced jovially. The others looked confused. What do you mean, Donnie? Ash asked curiously. The man just laughed and looked over at Salia as he reached down into their basket and pulled up a roll of rope. Bring that balloon in closer, miss, and I'll use this rope to tie our balloons together, he instructed. She obliged and brought her balloon in closer until it was flush with the Pikachu balloon. Donnie expertly tied both balloons together by tying an intricate knot around both front beams on each balloon. Once he tied the knots on the beams of their balloon and brought the two completely together, he hopped over into Salia's balloon. Ash and Brock held the tension on the rope to keep the two balloons together while Donnie tied the same knot off on the other balloon. Once he finished tying the first knot on the support beam of Salia's balloon, effectively linking together two ends of the balloons by the first rope, he called over to Ash. Hey there Ash. Wanna come over here and help me tie this fourth and final knot? I'll teach you how. The boy smiled and nodded eagerly. Sounds good, Donnie, thanks. Donnie smiled and waved Ash over. He carefully climbed into the other balloon, which was now connected to their own by the first rope link between the opposing support beams, and joined the older man. Donnie then went on to explain to Ash exactly how to go about tying the knot that would connect the support beams of both balloons together so they could connect and become safe for travel between them. Ash was able to pick up the rather complex knot after a few tries and some trial and error. After he was done and tied off the knot, Donnie inspected his work to make sure that the knot Ash made would hold up well with the one he himself made on the other balloon, and after he was assured it was secure, he clapped Ash on the back and praised him for his work. Great job, Ash. Now that that's done, we can move on to stage 2, he said enthusiastically. Ash smiled as well at the almost fatherly praise from the man and then watched as Donnie hopped back over into their own balloon. Now that the knots were finished and tied off, there were two on each front side of both balloons. The right and left front support beams were tied off strongly to their twins on either balloon, and this allowed the two of them to press flush together. Though, travel between the two could only be done whenever at least two people pulled hard on both ropes on either balloon to draw the baskets together completely. Otherwise, there would still remain a gap between them that was very dangerous to try and jump across. Ash and the others wondered what Donnie was doing but were quickly saved from their curiosity when he walked over to where Brock was standing. "Excuse me, Brock," he said boisterously as the older boy moved out of the way and gave the man access to whatever he was looking for. Donnie looked to a portion of the green basket, just below the railing, that was somewhat more extended out than the rest of the smooth sides and then looked over at Ash who was in Salia's balloon. "Okay Ash, I want you to locate the bulge-like protrusion over in that balloon. Should be on the left side," he instructed. Ash looked around and found what he was looking for right where Donnie said it would be. "Alright, I found it," he called back. The man grinned and then addressed them all. "Any of you wonder yet why the baskets in these balloons seem bigger and thicker than normal?" he asked with a tinge of something odd in his voice. Everyone looked around and noticed for the first time that the baskets of both balloons were actually bigger and yes, much thicker than what normal hot air balloons usually were made to be. Even though this was their first time in a balloon, the baskets still did seem different from what they had seen in shows, movies and magazines respectively. "Now that you mention it," Brock began, "they do seem a little unusual." Donnie grinned wider. "And do you know why that is?" Upon not receiving an answer from anyone, he laughed and then started to explain. "You see everyone, my balloons are different from most others. Mine have quite a few luxuries that other balloons don't have," he boasted with a smile. Misty raised an eyebrow. "Like?" Donnie patted the railing of the balloon. "The floor and walls of the baskets in these balloons have another set of movable walls and floors hidden within them. Thus, the increased size in baskets. Let me show you." He motioned for Brock, Misty and Giselle to stand behind him on the far side of the basket and then put his finger under a crease in the twine of the side of the basket he was standing in front of. More specifically, the slightly bulging lump that blended into the rest of the basket. He flipped up the bulge then and revealed a small control panel hidden underneath that had two buttons on it. A red and green one. He looked over at Ash and instructed him to lift up the flap covering the control panel on the other balloon. Ash did and then once the two buttons were revealed on his end, Donnie called over again. "Now Ash, I want you and Salia to stay as far back on the furthest end of the balloon as you can after you press that green button, okay? I'll tell you when to do it and once I do, we'll both press our respective green buttons together." The boy nodded. "Got it," he replied. Donnie smiled and then put his thumb over the button. "Ready," he called over. Ash got into position. "Ready." Donnie counted down. 3.2, now Ash. Both of them pressed down on the green buttons at the exact same time and then stepped back as both baskets literally started to move and shift internally. They could feel something happening around them and then the next thing they knew, both front sides of each balloon began to actually retract down into the basket floors. Once the front ends of both baskets were open, exposing the open sky down below, the bottom edges of both balloons started to open up. Out of the ends came two planks that were medium-sized in width and slid out until they met each other and then locked into place with a resounding click. Then, the size of the baskets started to expand themselves as the now connected walking plank grew wider along with the baskets. After the baskets had extended enough that the walking plank between both balloons now resembled a large square floor that was stretched out and connected to every end of both baskets being firmly suspended above the open sky and no longer leaving any room to fall out through a gap in between the balloons. The next change took place. The outside walls of the baskets slid open and allowed a wall on each basket to open on both ends. The walls that were coming out of all four corners of the frontmost side of both balloons slid out until they met together and then latched onto each other like a vine to a tree. The finished product, once all of the shifting and moving around was done, revealed a large square area now open in between both balloons. The two walls that came out of the very ends of the baskets and connected with each other now formed a perfect four-sided square on each end of the newly opened space that would keep them all safely inside. The walls and floor of the suspended patio were very strong and well supported. There were even four small but strong boards that ran long ways under the makeshift floor that connected to both ends of the baskets and offered extra support so people could walk and stand around on it without falling through. The two ropes that connected the front support beams on each balloon added extra connection support, but the new patio, did just fine at that particular job all by itself. The extendable walls which completed the four-corner structure were just as high as the walls in the basket themselves and assured even more so that no one would fall out. Once it was all done, Donnie took a minute to take in the shell-shocked expressions of his clients before laughing out loud and then turning around behind him to where Giselle, Misty and Brock were still standing in front of the backmost wall of the basket. "Excuse me kids," he said politely as he moved in and bent down to the floor. He reached underneath to the seam of the basket wall and lifted up on it, revealing a square compartment where 3 thin, foldable chairs were being kept. He reached in and grabbed them before walking out into the large area now created in between both balloons and set up the 3 long chairs at respectable spaces apart from one another. Once he was done, he looked at Ash again. "Can you do the same thing on your end, Ash?" he asked. Ash just nodded dumbly and then walked over to the back wall of the basket behind Salia. After she had moved away, Ash repeated what Donnie did and reached down to the floor, lifting up on the wall to reveal another square storage space where 3 more chairs were being held. He took them out and then walked over into the enclosed area between the balloons, stepping carefully out onto it at first to assure it didn't break open but then became more comfortable once he was assured of its strength and sturdiness. He placed the chairs out in an evenly spaced line with the ones Donnie set up and then moved back a little. Satisfied, Donnie looked at everyone. "Well, what are you all waiting for?" he asked in his usual excitable attitude while grinning again. Slowly and carefully, Ash's friends and Salia stepped out into the open, walled-in space and after seeing that the floor really wasn't going to give in, they started to relax. "Wow, Donnie," Brock spoke as he started moving around in the new area. "This is incredible. How is this possible?" Giselle asked as she also wandered around and admired the patio-like sitting area suspended between both balloons. Donnie laughed again and then answered. "I helped design these balloons some time back. Being that I've always been a bit of an inventor, I guess you could say, at least when it comes to things that fly like these hot air balloons here. They've been a passion of mine ever since I was little and started coming up here during the Butterfree mating seasons with my father, like his father before him. You see, my family has been involved with renting out hot air balloons to trainers and observers for the mating season here for as many years as I can count. Dating back to when people first learned that this was where Butterfree met to find mates before traveling across the sea to their mating grounds somewhere in the Orange Islands. Coincidentally, this was also right around the time that hot air balloons were first invented. So I suppose you could say that these balloons here are in my blood." He leaned back against the railing of the suspended patio and chuckled to himself after saying that. "Each of my family all came up with something new on how to improve these balloons in order to make the experience more enjoyable for visitors when they came here for the big event every year. I got the idea for this little lounging area connected in between the balloons when I first started bringing my wife and 2 sons up with me in the balloons during the off-season and we were crowded for space. I wanted to have some way for large groups of people in balloons to be able to meet and congregate up in the air but also be able to do it safely. That's when this idea popped into my mind. In theory, multiple balloons could probably link up together like this, sort of like a puzzle or a chain link, but only 2 has ever been done before and this is only the second time I've tried it," he explained. "My kids love it." "Wow, Mr. Donnie, thank you so much for sharing this with us," Salia said with a bow. "Yes, thank you so much, Donnie, this is great." Misty thanked him sincerely. Donnie just waved them off. "Think nothing of it. After what you kids did today to save the Butterfree, which allowed all of this to still happen so a years-long tradition wasn't broken by some low-down criminals, this was the least I could do." Ash smiled and nodded his head respectfully. "Still, Donnie, thanks a lot. For everything. And not just this either, but for being so kind with us today, teaching me how to fly these balloons and understanding whenever I went after Team Rocket. We can't thank you enough. I'm truly sorry that I snapped at you earlier on when you were at first reluctant to let me leave." Donnie patted Ash on the shoulder. "You're welcome for it all, young man, and I was happy to do it. You learn quick, so I was happy to teach you, and as for the Team Rocket thing. You're a trainer that obviously cares deeply for his Pokémon and were willing to do whatever was needed to save them, and I respect that. You beat Team Rocket and made it back safe, and you rescued all of the Butterfree. You did us all a great service and I should be thanking you, Ash." The man smiled genuinely at him. "You saved a tradition today. You, your friends and your Pokémon, and I'm glad to have met you all. I've also got some good stories now to tell my kids before bed, and I'm sure the tales of the brave young Pokémon trainer with a Pikachu who defeated a bunch of criminals with his friends and saved the Butterfree mating season will go down in my family's heritage for many years to come. Ash bowed his head to Donnie. Thank you, Donnie. That's all I can say, he said humbly. Hi, Pikachu. Pikachu added in as well. Brock suddenly intervened. I am curious about one thing though, Donnie. Who helped you design these balloons and then get them made anyway? Does your family own a company or something? The older man shook his head. Nah, my family's business is way too small for such a thing. Being that we make the most of the money for our small business during this particular event only and then just give out regular balloon rides around the area to random people for the rest of the year, we could never make enough income to finance such expensive advances in hot air travel. This is all I do too, so I couldn't afford to make all of these balloons by myself. He smiled fondly then. Ya see, my great-grandfather made close friends with an airman of great skill several years ago. The man's family was steeped in aviator history far exceeding my own, and several of them were actually key figures in some of the biggest achievements in avionic history, even himself being counted among them. Such achievements including flying some of the first ever airplanes. He revealed with a wink. Wow, the others said collectively. Donnie nodded and continued on. My great-granddad met his friend while vacationing way out in the Unova region on a search for a way to improve the design of our balloons for that following year's Butterfree mating season. The two met at a place called Mistralton City when my granddad passed through there for an expo on avionics, and they became fast friends afterwards. My granddaddy's friend helped him design the balloons for the following year, and ever since, our families have remained close. Only. Donnie laughed. While my family has remained pretty small time with what we do, my granddad's friend went on to found a big aviation company out in Unova that handles most of that region's flight business, air trade and other aviary means of business. They became pretty darn wealthy and are always willing to help my family out both creatively and financially whenever it comes to our small-time balloon business here. I'm real good friends with the current head of their family business. Met him during me and my family's own vacation out to Unova one year, and he helped me design and make the balloons we're in right now. Specifically the little extension we're all standing on. Ash nodded. They sound like a really cool family. Donnie just smiled again and replied back, sure are Ash, sure are. Some of the best people you'll ever meet in a big part of the city they live in and hail from. Mistralton just wouldn't be the same without them. Actually, their family even runs the Pokémon gym of Mistralton and has for years. My friend's father passed the business down to him years ago so he could focus on his passions, which were flying and running the gym, and from what I heard he's pretty good. Ash smiled at the thought of a gym in another region. Strong is he? He inquired curiously. Donnie responded. In fact, he's got a granddaughter, my friend's little girl, who's just like her granddaddy from what I'm told. Headstrong and confident like him, loves to fly and loves Pokémon. Especially flying types if memory serves. No real surprise there since I think that's what their gym specializes in, but I wouldn't really know since I don't keep up with Pokémon League stuff that's not right here in good old Kanto. He grinned somewhat goofily. My friend tells me that his little girl wants to fly planes for the family business and even take over as gym leader for her granddad when she's old enough. And from what I hear, she's got the spunk for it. I think her name was Skyla maybe. Yeah, I think that's right. A little older than you maybe, Ash. I know she's not had her Pokémon too awful long yet at least, he rambled on. Ash smiled to himself and made a mental note right then and there for some reason to file what Donnie just said away for later. Skyla, huh? She sounds pretty interesting. Wouldn't mind meeting her someday. He was interrupted from his thoughts by Giselle calling out suddenly, hey guys, look. She pointed out of the balloon. All of the Butterfree are starting to go back to their courting rituals again. The others ran over and looked out of the balloon as well, seeing that all of the other Butterfree indeed were getting ready to finish up their mating rituals. Donnie looked at the kids then. Why don't we take a seat and watch while we relax a little? He suggested. The small group sat back in the chairs that had been set up in the gathering space between both balloons and got themselves comfortable to watch the last bit of the Butterfree mating season. Donnie sat in the farthest chair to the right while Brock sat beside him and Misty took the place next to Brock. Ash sat in the second chair to the left of Misty, while Giselle sat on the chair right beside of him and Salia took the one on his other side. Giselle pulled her chair closer to Ash so their chairs could touch and then laid her chairs back like Ash did his, resting her head on his chest. He wrapped his arms around her and held her to him as he gently kissed the top of her head. Pikachu took a position curled up in Ash's lap while he watched the Butterfree and the young Ketchum just sighed in comfort as he held his girlfriend and rested back for the first real time all day. His body was still tired from the events that occurred earlier in the day and getting to rest like he was felt heavenly to him. Salia's chair was a little closer to Ash's as well than the others' chairs were and he noticed this, though he chose not to say anything and instead just smiled to himself. Both Butterfree were perched on top of the railing in front of them, their bodies touching as they too gazed out across the sky at their kin. Ash and the others watched in peace as the many Butterfree some distance away flew through the air with their chosen mates, performing their courtship dances in perfect tandem together. Each one was a little different than the other but none of them were done to the same level as Ash's Butterfree and the pink female's was. Still, they were all well done and definitely had heart in them, showing the deep feelings they held for their new mates. Some of the Butterfree even used different spore-based attacks for their dances and this caused the sky to shimmer with the shining particles of the attacks, making the scene even more beautiful and breathtaking than usual. Ash silently thanked Arceus for the marvel of nature being shown to them all and then reached down into his pack, right next to his chair with the hand not holding Giselle. He fished around in the main pocket until he found what he was looking for and pulled it out. He opened his Pokémon Researcher in Training journal and flipped it to the blank page. He then produced a pen from the pack and started writing down all of his thoughts on the Butterfree ritual he had been blessed enough to witness. Once he was done he put the journal away, along with the pen, and then turned his attention back to the Butterfree just as their rituals were coming to a close. They all started descending to the ground then with their new mates, followed by the many trainers also lowering their balloons to the ground. Donnie stood up from his chair and stretched out before looking at the others. "Well everyone, it's about time to head on down now," he announced while cracking his back. Ash and the others stood from their chairs and helped Donnie put the chairs back away in their storage compartments before Ash then started helping Donnie return the balloons to normal, which turned out to be as easy as it was to set it all up. All that was needed was for Ash and Donnie to both press the red button on the control panels located in the baskets of each balloon at the same time. Once this happened, the floor and walls of the open gathering space started to disengage from their attachment points and then retracted back into their original positions, which were safely stored inside of the large baskets of the balloons. After this was done, Ash and Donnie untied both balloons from each other and prepared to descend. Ash, on careful observation and instruction from Donnie, started lowering their balloon to the ground, followed closely behind by Salia in her balloon. Sometime later, they were all back on the ground safely again, having landed the balloons behind Donnie's shack where all of the other balloons